Hi guys, we're going to talk about chapter 20 now in the ManQ text, and when we get done with chapter 20, you will study for the material from 18, 19, and 20, the section that I'm referring to as all about work. I put a study guide into this week's Google Classroom so that you can be best prepared for that test. Please make sure that you're well prepared before you attempt to take that. No books, no notes as usual. But here we're going to get into the material from chapter 20, income inequality and poverty. And so let's get started with some new material. We're going to break this up into a couple of different videos. What we're going to do first is just talk about how much income inequality or how much poverty there really is in the United States. Then we'll talk about some philosophies about what people think about that, and then we'll talk finally about some things that a government perhaps can do or not do, and I'll explain what I mean by that, to address some of these issues. All right, so we're going to start out as ManQ does with kind of taking his own principles and kind of talking about how they can kind of work in opposition. So if you think about poverty or income inequality, the fact that not everyone makes the same amount of money and that some people are very poor, even within the United States, what should be done about that? Now, that's a philosophical question as well as an economic question and a political question. So we're going to hold off on the philosophy for a minute. We'll get to that in another teaching lesson. But right now, I just want to talk about it factually. So here we have two people kind of rowing in opposition against each other. And I liked this because of the idea that ManQ's principles can have a little bit of a working against each other, depending on how you look at them. So we learned that ManQ says, one of his principles is that government can sometimes improve market outcomes. And we talked at the beginning of the year about how this is a philosophical idea, but depending on what we believe government is doing, we may believe that it improves market outcomes or not. But let's just state that as a ManQ principle, all right? Government can improve market outcomes. So one might say, well, government might be able to then intervene in the area of income inequality or intervene in the area of poverty and improve what otherwise would be the outcome of the market. But ManQ also believes two other principles, that people face trade-offs. And so whenever you have a government acting in a way to improve market outcomes, there may be losses on the other side of those outcomes, losses to freedom, losses to efficiency, a number of things that we might say. And also, we have to remember that people respond to incentives. And so as government intervenes in an economy, they have to be careful of both a negative response to a positive incentive and then a response to an incentive that can seem like punishment. So for instance, a heavily progressive tax will tax people at a higher rate of their income the more they make. And so does that give people a negative incentive or a disincentive to work to get into the next tax bracket if they believe that their money is going to be taken through taxation and redistributed? And so this is the way that we're going to start, just talking about the fact that, yes, we're going to talk in this chapter about government improving market outcomes, but we're going to handle this carefully and wisely. We're going to think about it and discuss it. First thing we're going to do, though, is talk about the amount of poverty in the United States and really look at the income numbers. Now, you're going to have to pay attention to the years on the slides that follow. ManQ's latest numbers are from 2003, and so these will be the numbers will be a little bit under, but the distribution shouldn't be too different. So let's take a look at this first graph. This is found in your text on page 432. the distribution of income in the United States. I had to redo this because I couldn't find a good shot of it on the internet, and I didn't want to hold the book up. So distribution of income. Now remember, Thomas Sowell doesn't even like this term distribution of income because he kind of says it sounds like the income is being handed out rather than the income is flowing in a pattern based on the market. Nonetheless, we know what we're trying to say here is how does the income fall out amongst, and remember we talked about this last week, amongst the quintiles. You see these fifths that the economy is divided up into in the chart. Those are called quintiles. And so you see that in the US in 2003, the bottom fifth annual family income was under $24,000, right? 24,117. And you have the second fifth was between 24,117 and 42,000 and some odd change. The middle fifth between 42,000 and 65,000. This is for a family income now, okay? Fourth fifth, 65,000 to 98,200. Top fifth, 98,200 and over. Now, because this is family income, that means that if it's a single mother, that's the family income. Okay, if it means it's two married people working in the prime of their lives, that is the family income. Okay, and those issues, especially the issue of marriage and two-parent family household incomes, is going to be significant as we talk about the distribution of income and we talk about poverty. But what you see here is this idea that the bottom fifth, right, of the bottom fifth of the annual family income is under 24,117. And so we get an idea of how many, we get an idea of that bottom fifth. What we don't get an idea of is how much of the total income in the United States is going to that bottom fifth, as opposed to how much of the total income is going to the higher quintiles. So let's take a look at this next bracket. I want to make sure I'm getting everything here. All right, so this is income equality in the United States, and what it's showing you is the total before tax income. Now, let me get rid of my face here for a second. The before tax income, okay, is an important phrase because after taxes, it's a game changer, all right? And the taxation policies of the United States are going to change somewhat significantly how income is distributed. But what we're interested in looking at are two things on this graph. So let's look at those together. Okay, so first of all, something that ManQ wants us to note is that if you took all of the income, now this is before taxes, okay? And the bottom fifth of Americans do not pay income taxes, all right? They may have things pulled out of their check, but they get that money back and more. We'll talk about that when we get next week into the taxation chapter. They do pay things like sales taxes, and that's why sometimes sales taxes can be considered something called a regressive tax, and we'll talk about that in taxation too. But if you look at all the income earned in the United States before taxation, the bottom fifth right now is only taking 4.1% of that income. That's a pretty big deal, okay? Whereas the top fifth takes 47.6% of that income, okay? So your top 20%, right, are making 47.6% of the income before taxes, whereas your bottom fifth is only 4.1%. Now, if you look at the gap here, okay, starting pretty far back, okay, in the country's history, this has been true. And so your top fifth of wage earners are responsible for, well, we won't get to their generation yet. Your top fifth of wage earners, they represent these families a good deal, right? Almost half of the income in the United States. And so we could say that there is income inequality, okay? If you looked at the United States compared to the rest of the world, how much income inequality do we have? Well, first of all, two things. Being below the poverty line or being in the second fifth or being in the middle class is relative to your country, okay? So certainly the bottom fifth of wage earners in the United States that only earn 4.1% of the total income, if you compare them, okay, and not just their income, but their standard of living to the poor in many countries in the world, they would have a much better standard of living. We're not talking about that they would make more, okay, of course they would make more, but I'm talking about their standard of living. The standard of living, and I'm not trying to imply that it's great to be poor in the United States, but if you compare that to many countries in the world, all right, the state standard of living for a person living in poverty in the United States still allows people to not die of starvation, to eat 3 square meals a day. In fact, the USDA has a specific standard for what they call hunger. And, you know, when someone's facing food instability or hunger, what the USDA defines that as, because the Department of Agriculture is the one that defines hunger in the United States, it means that you may not know where your next meal is coming from. It does not mean that you're consuming under a certain amount of calories per day, like poverty would be measured in many places in the world. Nonetheless, okay, the income inequality in the United States will tell us that, first of all, yes, relatively, the poor may be better off. Now, if you wanted to compare the United States income inequality, right, you wanted to ask, well, wow, this seems like the United States has a lot of rich people that are taking a huge percent of that income. Is this true all over the world, or is this particular to the U.S.? If you compare the United States and other developed countries, Mankiw says that it's about mid-pack. We come in, you know, let's say in the top 7, 8, 9 developed countries, we're coming in somewhere around 4, 5 in terms of income inequality. So there are places where there's a greater income inequality in the developed world, and then there are places where there is less income inequality. And so when we think about where we are, we want to ask ourselves, okay, well, what's a percentage? You understand these percentages are of total income earned. What percentage does this quintile take? Let's get into a little more facts, okay? So let's look at why we have to know the numbers pre-tax because of what happens post-tax. So very quickly, when you're asking about the poverty rate, okay, the United States defines both a poverty rate and a poverty line, okay? I would like you to get these down very specifically, please, okay? The poverty rate, okay? The United States sets up what is called a poverty line, and anyone who falls below that line is living in the poverty rate. And so this graph takes us all the way to 2017. I want you to look at the red line, okay? And let's get down this poverty line definition. If you want to copy it down, it's on page 434 in the bottom of your book. You are going to need to know it for the upcoming test. Here we go. The poverty line is an absolute level of income set by the federal government for each family size below which a family is deemed to be in poverty. Okay, and this poverty line is set by the federal government, but it is going to vary from state to state, okay, because incomes vary from state to state. An absolute level of income set by the federal government for each family size below which a family is deemed to be in poverty. That's the poverty line. And once you define the poverty line, you can get the poverty rate, the percentage of the population whose family income falls below the poverty line. Okay? Now, this income set by the federal government, you might ask, well, how do they set the poverty line? When they say, this is the line by which families are deemed to be in poverty, the poverty line can be said to be 3 times the number of dollars it takes for a family to have a healthy, square diet. Okay, so they take what it costs a family to eat for a year, and then they multiply that, okay, by 3, and that is an income number that's given. Below that income number, and of course that income number is going to change then, you fall below the poverty line, and that means that you are part of what makes up the poverty rate in the United States. Now, in 2017, the poverty rate in the United States was 12.3%. 12.3%. And you can see that this poverty rate has been very high at times and lower at others. But if you notice, the poverty rate since the 70s has remained fairly steady, okay? This number of people in the United States who fall underneath the poverty line never really dips to anywhere near 0%. And after 1959, it never gets really up near, let's see, after 1965, it really never gets back above 15%. And so we have this, I guess, good news, bad news, is that it's not a large majority of Americans at all living in poverty, but it is a pretty constant rate. And what do we do about that? And how do we explain that there are so many government programs, so many charities, so many ideas aimed at eliminating poverty? We hear about that all the time, and yet we seem to have a pretty steady poverty rate in the United States. And we want to ask ourselves some important questions about that in this chapter. I'm going to conclude, though, with this slide when we talk about why it's important to look at the before tax rate and after tax rate. Okay, so this is the same thing, the quintiles. This is a 2014 graph. This is the quintiles, and they're broken down after, okay, and before transfers and taxes. So I want you to look at this. In the green, all right, you have the income levels. All right, so you see your lowest quintile, right, down here in the 24,000 range, right? Here, the second quintile, third quintile, fourth quintile, and highest quintile. Okay, in the purple, you see what those same quintiles' incomes are after they have been taxed. And by transfers, transfer payments are payments that are made from one societal group to another. In this case, we could look at from one quintile to another. So these are taxes that are taken by federal by federal taxes and federal transfers only. So this doesn't even count state taxes, okay? Federal taxes would include Social Security, Medicare, and so when you look at this, okay, you are taking a look at what happens to the highest quintile. Now, you might look at this and say, well, nothing really happens to them. I mean, look at their income. It's still so much higher. But I want you to understand the transfer aspect. And this is why we have to be careful when we look at the poverty numbers, because if you look, you will notice that the purple, okay, the amount of total income allows the bottom 2 fifths, all right, the lowest fifth and the second fifth, to gain on their income. In other words, their income is higher after the transfers and taxes take place, whereas for the middle class and the 2 upper quintiles, all right, their income is lower because their money is being taxed and then transferred or redistributed to the lower two quintiles. And so when we talk about poverty, and we're looking at absolute income numbers, it doesn't give us the clearest picture of how people in the lowest quintile live because it's harder to factor in the value of these transfer payments. These transfer payments are non-cash payments. Okay, they're non-cash payments. There used to be more what you might call a welfare check. Okay, this idea that people get a certain amount of money from the federal government every month, a welfare check that they cash. But since welfare reform and changes and responses to incentives being recognized, a lot of welfare has changed. And so when we look at what we call in-kind transfers, okay, these are important to understand, in-kind transfers, then we may not totally have the clearest picture of what a person in the lowest quintile is actually living like. Because in-kind transfers, they include things like housing assistance, food stamps, Medicaid. So someone who's living in that lowest quintile or even the second quintile that gets Medicaid, their health care paid for, that gets federal housing assistance or assistance with child care, assistance with job training, assistance with housing, assistance with food every month. Those numbers are not included in the raw income numbers that you saw out at the beginning of the slides today. And so the in-kind transfers, they skew what the lowest quintile is living like, and it skews the view of what poverty in America really is. Another thing that Sol pointed out is life cycle. Where are you, okay, in the cycle of your life? When someone appears in the lowest quintile, it doesn't mean that they will always stay there. Sometimes we look at those poverty numbers and we think, okay, well, this 12.3% is always the same 12.3% throughout their lifetime, but that's not always true. A lot of people move out of the lowest quintile in America because of the income mobility that we have over a lifetime, their chance to earn human capital, education, on-the-job training, job experience, working in something longer. And some people don't do that. Some people do get to do that, and they certainly move out of the lowest quintile in their lifetime. It's important also to understand that sometimes people could fall into the lowest quintile for a specific time. In other words, since it's based on income, if a person is in school and they are living on a very, very low income because they are trying to get a degree, they've moved in with their parents, or they're in a difficult situation, they could fall into that lowest quintile for a short time. So that also has to do with life cycle. And so we have to be careful when we look at that bottom quintile into getting into locked in thinking. Are they in a transition point, what Mankiw calls transitory income, or are they in more of a permanent income state when they're in those lowest brackets? In the United States, we have income mobility, which means that many people who are born into the lowest quintiles in America will make it into much higher positions financially. And some people who are in the higher quintiles will find themselves moving down in life. And so that has to do partially with the free market, with incentives, and with the freedom and therefore risk that Americans are given as part of our system of economics and government. And so I hope that helps you to understand a little bit about how much actual income inequality and poverty there is in the United States, and some of the factors that you need to know, such as the poverty line, poverty rate, the income inequality gaps, how much is actually earned. And what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about the philosophy, about what people think one should do about this, if anything. We're going to look at 3 different philosophies that Mankiw presents, and then we're going to round out with talking about policy that may or may not be helpful in addressing the issues of poverty in the United States. All right,